Tov, today's daf yomi is Bava Basra daf Samach Vav, Bava Basra 66. We're going to start on the bottom of 65b. So the Gemara is discussing the concept of when you sell a house, you sell things that are with the house that are attached to the house, attached to the ground. But if it's not attached to the house, it's not sold. What if it's something that was made, not attached, and then attached? So Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer's position is, even though it was made not attached, if it was then attached, it's considered attached, and then it's sold with the house. But the Gemara then cites a brisa about a mikvah, and that's what we'll talk about now. Mikvah, in order for it to be a kosher mikvah, it needs to have mekis shamim or meimayon, spring water or rainwater, but not mayim sheluvin, not mayim that was drawn from a utensil. But if something's attached to the ground, it's not a utensil. Well, what if it was made into a utensil and then attached to the ground? So that's what the Gemara discusses. Tzino, or a pipe, shechakaku, you make it into a pipe, ubasov kavu, and then you attach it to the ground. Posos a mikvah. According to the Rabbanon, it disqualifies the mikvah. But kavu sov chakaku ain't no posos a mikvah. But if it was attached to the ground the whole time, and then you make it into a pipe, then it doesn't disqualify the mikvah. So the Gemara says, whose position is this that says that if it was made into a utensil and then attached to the ground, it doesn't disqualify the mikvah? It doesn't sound like Rabbi Eliezer, because the way we just described Rabbi Eliezer about a house is that he says if it's attached to the ground, even after it's made into a utensil, it's sold with the house. And here it's saying if it's attached to the ground after it's made into a utensil, it disqualifies the mikvah. So that doesn't sound like Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, who is this? Lo Rabbi Eliezer v'lo Rabbanan. The Gemara says, well, which Rabbi Eliezer is it not? Is it not? Are you saying it's a problem with Rabbi Eliezer of the house? Hi, Rabbi Eliezer. Which Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Eliezer Tobias. If you want to say it's a problem because of Rabbi Eliezer is shita by a house, time with Rabbi Eliezer. Maybe the reason for Rabbi Eliezer by a house is savar mocher bayin yafa mocher. Maybe it has nothing to do with whether it's attached to the ground, but rather he says that the seller sells with a generous eye. And so therefore he means to include it, even though it's not technically speaking attached to the ground. Rabbanan Savri Mocher Bayin Ran. The rabbis say it's not attached to the ground. The guy still a little stingy, so he wouldn't include it. It's a specific law about selling with a generous eye. But maybe in the case of the mikvah, he would view it as attached to the ground. He would not view it as attached to the ground in this case, since it was made into a utensil beforehand and then attached. So the Gemara says maybe it must be Rabbi Eliezer de Kaveres. Maybe it must be Rabbi Eliezer by a beehive. Beehive is something that's made a beehive, and then you go and you attach it to the ground. So, because what do we learn about a beehive? The Tanan we learned in the Mishnah about a beehive. This is the Mishnah in Shavias, that it says, Rabbi Eliezer says, Kaveres Devorim, Rabbi Eliezer teaches, Harayiki Karka, it's considered to be like real estate. So when we have a beehive which is taken and attached to the ground, Rabbi Eliezer says it's considered to be like real estate. That's inconsistent with the shita of the mikvah that says if you take a utensil and attach it to the ground, it's not considered like attached to the ground because it disqualifies the mikvah. And not only does it consider like real estate, the kosono of pruzbo, in order for a pruzbo is something that does not, it's a document that helps you not cancel the debts that otherwise would be canceled on a Shemitah year. In order for a pruzbo to be written, it has to be written on a loan that's connected to real estate. Rashbam gives two answers, either because that shows that the loan was collateralized, or else because he quotes his Rabbi Zucchini, his grandfather Rashi, that it's because that's a typical case of a loan where there's security of a real estate. So if a beehive, you could write a pruzbo on it. It's considered like your own real estate, and top of 66a. And like all real estate, it does not contract tuma bimkoma in its place. And since considered attached to the ground, if you want to take some honey on Shabbos from the beehive, chayav chatas, you're liable for a sin offering, like taking something off of attachment to the ground. So we see in this case, he views something that was a utensil and then attached to the ground as though it is attached to the ground, unlike the case of the mikvah. Chachamim argue, they take the opposite position of Rabbi Eliezer in all these cases. So you want to say that the case of the brayso of the mikvah contradicts the Mishnah of Rabbi Eliezer. or it proves it's not him. So the Gemara says, no, there it's not necessarily a contradiction with the Bryce of the mikvah, because Hasam, I'm a Rabbi Eliezer Taima. There, Rabbi Eliezer gave a specific reasoning. What's his specific reasoning that he says that the beehive is considered like it's attached to the ground? The Gemara explains it's a specific reasoning. What's the specific reasoning? Dama Rabbi Eliezer, my time the Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer said, Rabbi Eliezer, this is the Amora, Rabbi Eliezer ben Padas, who's coming to explain the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer. He says, what's the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer? What's the reasoning why Rabbi Eliezer says specifically that a beehive is that if you take honey from the beehive on Shabbos, you're liable for taking something from you're liable for a sin offering. What's the reason why for Rabbi Eliezer there? It's specifically a unique law about honey, because there's a verse about honey in the book of Shmuel. We're on 66a in the middle. What's the verse about honey from the book of Shmuel? It says, that Yonatan, he was fasting and he was in a battle, and he took out his he had not heard that his father had taken oath that you weren't allowed to eat, and so he took out his staff and he dipped it in the Yaros Tvash, and he ate it. He ate from the honey. But why is it called Yaros Tvash, the forest of honey? It should just be say honey. So it's to tell us, my Yar, just like Yar, just like a forest, if you remove from it on Shabbos, you're liable for a sin offering. So too, honey, if you remove from it on Shabbos, you're liable for a sin offering. So again, we see from here that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that honey is a special law, and that's why it's considered like it's attached to the ground. So the Gemara is still searching. What are we searching for? We had the case of a mikvah, where the shita, the position in the case of the mikvah, was that if you take something, fashion it into a utensil, and then attach it to the ground, it's still not going to be considered attached to the ground. It's still considered like it's an independent utensil, and to disqualifies the mikvah because it's of mayim shuvin, of drawn water. And the Gemara then stated that this Bryce is not Rabbi Eliezer. We're trying to say, or the Rabbanan. So which Rabbi Eliezer is it not like? So we want to see which Rabbi Eliezer is for sure a contradiction to the Rabbi Eliezer of the mikvah. The Gemara says, El Rabbi Eliezer the daf. The Rabbi Eliezer that contradicts the shita of the mikvah is Rabbi Eliezer of a board. This is a Mishnah in Kalim that talks about, let's say we have a board of a baker, Dav Shal Nachtomen. There's an interesting Rashbam here. What kind of board of a baker? Rashbam says, interesting to me because I was interested in medieval Europe. Rashbam says, this is a board, Shekavua Bakoso, it's attached to the wall to put the bread upon to sell. Ke'ein Sha'osin Palterin Shalano Bakoso Bakami Bachutz. Like our bakers do on their outside walls. They put a board on their outside walls, and they put the bread on there and they sell it. So that's what this is, Rashbam says. This is a baker's board, shekavu bakoso, they attach to the wall. So basically you have a utensil, and then you attach it to the ground. Now, if it's attached to the ground, it's not something attached to the ground cannot contract tumah. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying here is matayar, that even though it was a utensil, once you attach it to the ground, you're viewing it as though it's attached to the ground. It turns back into the ground and it's no longer a utensil. That contradicts what we said with the mikvah, because the mikvah, we have a utensil, a pipe, and then we attach it to the ground, and it remains a pipe. It's not attached to the ground to disqualify the mikvah. So at first glance seems to contradict it. And the Chachamim say in this case, the board will still become tameh. So therefore, the Gemara wants to say, who is this Mishnah and Kalim like? Rabbi Eliezer, if you want to say it's like Rabbi Eliezer, well, it contradicts the mikvah. Afilu chakaku or besov kavu, because Rabbi Eliezer said in the case of the mikvah that if you make it into utensil and attach it to the ground, it's not considered attached to the ground. That makes the mikvah disqualified. And here he's saying that the board, once it's attached to the ground, becomes like the ground. It can't become tameh. And Rabbanon, and if you want to say it's the Rabbanon, afilu kavu or besov chakaku nami. The Rabbanon's position is that if it was fixed to the ground, in the Rabbanon's position here is that it's tameh, this baker's this baker's board, because we're going to say that since it was a utensil, but the Rabbanon's position should be, in the case of the mikvah, that if we follow that approach, even if it was utensil, even if it was made a utensil while it was attached to the ground, it should also become tamei. I feel couple of a sof chako, even while it was attached to the ground, and then you engraved it, the rabbi should say it's tamei. So therefore, who is the Bryce like? So the Gemara says, okay, let's go back and say, well, Olam Rabbi Eliezer, our Bryce is Rabbi Eliezer. He says in the case of the mikvah that if you take a utensil attached to the ground, the mikvah will become drawn water. But here he rules that the board is tahor. Why? Because he says, Shani pshute kliates. This is not really a utensil to the beginning. This is just a piece of wood. And we say in general, a piece of wood that we're calling a board, that's just called tumah d'rabbanan. It's just rabbinic tumah. So therefore, since it's just rabbinic tumah, if you then are going to attach it to the ground, we're going to view it as tahor, because it's a rabbinic stringency, and so therefore, once it's reattached to the ground, we'll view it as attached to the ground and call it tahor. So the Gemara says, "Mikal de she'iva de araisa." Whoa! So you want to say that she'iva, that the reason why you're strict by mikvah is because it's a mikvah and it's drawn water. So you want to say the prohibition of a mikvah, of using drawn water by a mikvah, is biblical, but it can't be. Ve'ha kaimo under Rabbanan. We say it's rabbinic. We say that mikvah is that the prohibition of using mikvah water, drawn water, what we call tap water, is rabbinic. I'm just gonna. This is going to take us too far afield, but I just want to note in passing that everyone says it's biblical prohibition to fill a mikvah just with tap water, but it's a question of how much tap water it makes it biblical, and how much is rabbinic. So that's where there's the gray area. But therefore, we're saying the Gemara here is assuming it's rabbinic. Our mikvahs today, when you go into a mikvah, like the mikvah we built at Ov Shalom, that's tap water. So how are we going into that mikvah? Just say that in passing. How are we going into that mikvah? It's tap water. You're not going to use it. It didn't rain one time when we built the mikvah 10 years ago. We're not still using that rainwater. It's that would be disgusting. You have to use a chlorine. And so what do? So what happens is we fill up an initial pit with rainwater. Then we do 3 techniques, which the Chazal say, to make sure that we can combine tap water with the initial rainwater to make it a kosher mikvah. One is called hashaka. We build another pit next to it and fill that pit with tap water, and then we make a space in between to allow them to so-called kissing. And that creates a mingling of the waters, and then we're able to keep replenishing the tap water with chlorine, etc., and make the rainwater usable. Second thing we do is called hamshacha. That hamshacha is that before we put the tap water straight into the mikvah, it goes on the ground a little bit, and that makes the mayim shuvin no longer considered drawn water. And so then it could combine with the rainwater, and then it's okay. And then the third thing we do is zriya, where it overflows from a different pit. So we use all 3 of these techniques, and in doing so, that's how the modern mikvah works. Because otherwise, it would be very difficult, because the water would have to be changed out. But what did they do before they did this? How did women go to the mikvah before they had the modern plumbing? So they went to wells. It was extremely dangerous. Imagine going to a well at night, going down to a deep well all by yourself with snakes and rats. And that's what they did. They were moser nefesh. You had a question, Eric? We have to catch the rainwater, but only the first time. You can't have to catch rainwater every time. But even now, what are you going to do in places where it doesn't rain a lot? And also, going to rainwater, the third person goes in, it's kind of disgusting already. So the Gemara says, Va'od, we're on top of 66b, Va'od, ha'amar Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, b'dav shamatechas machokas. Another problem, you can't say that this shita, Rabbi Eliezer, is just by a wooden board, because Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina said we're talking about a metal board, which is a biblical utensil, and therefore it is tamei, biblically speaking. So therefore, we're going to say that brisa that says that if it's attached to the ground, initially speaking, it's kosher mikvah, but if it was first utensil and then attached to the ground, its pasul is like the Rabbanon. And if that's the case, why do they not allow? Why do they say if it was attached to the ground and then turned into a utensil, it's not a disqualifying mikvah? Because shani she'iva de Rabbanon. The rabbis say that we can be lenient in the case of the mikvah of drawn water because it's rabbinic. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if that's the case, well, then even if they engraved it and then attached it to the ground, it should be, if they engraved it and then attached it to the ground, it should also be considered to be a kosher mikvah. Gemara says, Shani As and Nikotoras Klio Avitolish. No, there we're going to be strict because there we actually had called it a utensil when it was detached from the ground. Okay, so by Rav Yosef, now Rav Yosef comes along and asks the following question. Mega Shamim Shachishev Aleim Wahadiach Esad Stroblin Mahu was Ryan. Okay, so the basic, we have to do a little bit of an introduction here. So there are 7 liquids. In order for a food item to become tamei, the food item must first have become huksher l'kabel tuma. Something that grows from the ground. It has to be first capable of becoming tamei. It has to be prepared to become tamei. How does it become prepared to become tamei? If one of 7 liquids falls on it, then it becomes huksher. Once the liquid's on it, it can become tamei. What are these 7 liquids? Yad shachatam. That's the way to remember it. Yayin, wine. Dam, blood. Shin is shemen. Ches is cholav. Tes is tal. Dalet is dvash. And mem is mayim. So if any of those 7 liquids fall on the food item, it can become tamei. However, there's 2 limiting factors that the person who owns the produce must want it to come down. It has to come with his interest. And that's the first aspect of it. And this goes to say he wants it to come down, even if he doesn't want it to go, even if it's initial, he wanted it was on something else, but then it ended up on the food item, that's considered like he wanted it. And number 2, it has to come down for the purpose on something that's a movable item and not something that's attached to the ground. So by Rav Yosef, so now Rav Yosef asks the question, Mega Shamim, Shechashav Aleim Wadiach Hasa Stroblin, Ma'ul Israel. So the person wanted his rainwater to come down, but he only wanted it to come down for the purpose of falling on this stroblin. This stroblin is one of these utensils, which was like part of the mill that was first a utensil and then attached to the ground. So is it considered like he wanted it to go on something attached to the ground, or considered like on a utensil, in which case it would be capable of making something tummy, or like attached to the ground, in which case it can? So that's the question. How do we consider it? I'll leave it to Rebbe Lezer. Now, according to the position of Rebbe Lezer, who he said, Rebbe Lezer said anything that's detached from the ground, but then you attach it, it's considered like it's attached to the ground. Well, in this case, it's considered like it's attached to the ground, and it won't make you tamei. And so therefore, the food item will not become tamei. Kiti bailach, I'll leave with the Rabbanan. It's only a question according to the rabbis who say the rabbis are in the position that once it's attached to the ground, if it was not initially attached to the ground, it won't become. It's not capable. That if it was not initially attached to the ground, then we're viewed as detached, even though now it's attached, and so therefore maybe it should make the item tamei. So, because they say dami eno kakarka, they say that something that was detached and then attached is not considered like the ground. So what would the Rabbanan say in this case with respect to the Zrayim, meaning to the seeds? Do we say by a house they rule differently because they say that the mocher sold it by and rice, sold it with a stingy eye, didn't include it? Or do we say in the case that we still would view it as the same matter, and so therefore it's considered not attached, and so the item will become tamei? Gemara leaves this question as teku, unresolved, and so that's that. So now the Gemara has another case before we end this sugya. Shalchei Rav Nechemya Bered Rav Yosef Rabba Bered Rav So he says, when this woman comes before you Agba Isur Naske Afilumi Istribule Durechayim. So he wasn't even asking a question, he was just teaching a law. When this woman comes before you, collect for her, collect for her from the inheritance a tenth of the assets, even from this Istrubli of the Rechayim. Okay, well, we have to take a step back here and say, what are we talking about here? So the first thing we need to remember is we're talking that by biblical law, the sons inherit, but not the daughters. But, excuse me, assuming there are sons. If there are sons, the sons inherit, but not the daughters. But the rabbis obviously knew that that was not completely viable. And the Chachamim wanted to make sure that the daughters were provided for. And so therefore the Chachamim instituted that the daughters would be able to collect, before the estate was divided, 10% of the estate to pay for their wedding, for dowry, for a wedding. And so therefore, that was the takana of the Chachamim, but that was only instituted to be paid for from real estate, not from movables. And so therefore, he said here, Rav Nechemia, the son of Rav Yosef, said to Rabbi Reid Rav Huna, he said, when this woman comes before you, make sure you collect her 10% of the estate. And I feel me, it's stribui derechayim. Even from this, it's stribui, meaning to say, we're going to paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, that even though it was detached from the ground, but then it was attached, we view it as real estate. And you could collect her 10% even from there. By the way, it could come out from this 10%. We learned in Maseches Ksubos that the sons can actually inherit nothing as a result of the takana, or almost nothing, because let's say there's 10 daughters, they keep dividing up the estate, and then the sons, it comes off before the sons inherit. So people who say, "Oh, the men get everything," no, the Torah said that only the boys inherit, but the rabbis basically very much weighted to make sure that the daughters got paid first. So that's just something to have in the background. So Amar Avashi ki Avina Rav Kahana. Hold on. He said when I was at Rav Kahana's basically court, Magbina nafilu me amoa debasi. Then he said we could collect for this 10% even from the rental properties. That the rental properties are considered like real estate because the money from the real estate is considered like real estate. This is already something that's more attenuated. Why was the money from the real estate considered like real estate? But we see from here that there started to be a recognition already in the time of the Gemara that real estate is just the concept of something that's a secured asset. And so therefore rental property is also a secured asset. And so that's an interesting development in Rav Kahana. Okay, we just want to stop the recording here. Say to Rabbi Yosef,